We are living through the end of a world order that has existed since 1945, or it's existed in stages since 1945. The stage that we are living through, I believe, began in around 1991. Um, Arguably, it was fatally undermined in 2008. It was impacted significantly in 2001 when with the beginning of the war on terror in 9/11, um, and it has reached after 2016 maybe an ongoing rolling crisis has now reached its kind of apogee, and we are going to see the collapse of an imperium before too long, and there will be, I believe, international chaos for a long time following that. Um, what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from a great book that I refer to from time to time, Postwall Post Square by Kristina Spohr. Um, and we're going to look at the American response to the end of the Cold War under George H.W. Bush. So join us now on the Explaining History podcast. Whilst American policy throughout the 1980s had been geared towards a final economic collapse of the Soviet Union, um, no American policy planners could really have anticipated the speed with which it happened and the relative, for as far as the Americans were concerned, um, the relative low cost of its occurrence. The fact that it didn't end in a continental war in Europe, the fact that it didn't end with the threat of a nuclear exchange. Empires generally don't tend to dissemble themselves neatly. And as we shall see, across Russia and beyond, the Soviet Empire doesn't eventually dissemble itself neatly. The people of Grozny, the people in Georgia, and people in Ukraine will all attest to this. But in 1991, there was room for significant triumphalism. And part of the kind of end of history thesis, of which we talk about quite regularly on this podcast, is kind of borne out temporarily by the events of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's of course Vladimir Putin's contention that the uh, end of the Soviet Union was, or perhaps an unparalleled tragedy in Russian history, and almost completely unnecessary. Um, there was a very interesting conversation, I think it was on Novara Media a few weeks ago, in which between Bastani and Tariq Ali, and the kind of the consensus was that in fact, whilst some kind of reform was almost essential in the Soviet Union, because the stifling nature of the command economy meant that it's essentially it was virtually impossible to run any kind of economic system, whether or not you're an ascriber to free market kind of Hayekian ideals, or broadly kind of socially democratic, you know, Roosevelt New Deal kind of stuff, you know, Keynesianism. The level of bureaucratism in the Soviet Union meant that neither of those things could possibly have worked, and even a command economy can't work. Not to say that command economies in general can't work. I mean, if you look at America and Britain during the Second World War, command economies functioned exceedingly effectively. But the nature of the Soviet Union at the end of its run was one that was kind of being throttled by bureaucratism. There are stories of warehouses full of stuff being produced, shoes, but there's no indication as to why they should be produced. There's no indication through any kind of market signals or any kind of other system of kind of allocation distribution. There's things like central planning bureaucracies from the Brezhnev era, which tried to kind of address these questions. But it's not that the Soviet Union couldn't produce things; it produced actually surpluses of things. It produced, in some ways, way too much stuff. But there was no. They were sometimes making shoes for people that didn't exist. You know, they're making 5 million shoes when for that shoe size and that shoe color and that shoe shape, there were perhaps 2.5 million people to wear them, that sort of thing. So um, the end of the Soviet Union is something that is perhaps a slightly, or the kind of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, this takes us perhaps slightly out of the scope of this one, because we're focusing more on America. And I think there's an interesting line through from that moment of triumphalism to the kind of the madness that we see now, which is the madness born of a particular kind of hubris, and one where I think it seems pretty clear from the Trump regime that they know that the empire's days are numbered, particularly if the petrodollar goes down, which it makes it increasingly likely. Anyway, so Kristina Spohr writes, the 29th of January 1991, and she quotes George H.W. Bush, members of the United States Congress. Bush's tone was sombre and measured, in contrast to the triumphalism of the State of the Union message he had delivered a year before, when he spoke of communism crumbling and the beginning of a new era for the world. This January, however, Bush was the first president since the Vietnam era to address Americans whilst their country was at war. We stand at a defining hour. Halfway around the world, we are engaged in a great struggle in the skies and on the seas and sands. What is at stake is more than one small country. It's a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom and the rule of law. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi armed forces had invaded the tiny emirate of Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990. Within 48 hours, he had brought the oil-rich sheikhdom brutally under his control. The border disputes and political rivalries between the two neighbours had a long and tortured history, but for Bush, the invasion of Kuwait was a stark and simple issue of lawless aggression. he reminded Congress in his State of the Union address Saddam Hussein's unprovoked invasion, his ruthless, systematic rape of a peaceful neighbor, violated everything in the community of nations holds dear. The world has said this aggression would not stand, and it will not stand. Together we've resisted the trap of appeasement, cynicism, and isolation that gives temptation to tyrants. Of course, the thing that gave temptation to this particular tyrant was a green light from the US ambassador to Kuwait and from the State Department and from the CIA that it probably wouldn't be too much trouble, and it would probably be sort of all right if Saddam Hussein evened the kind of even the odds with Kuwait and took annexed the country, to which Iraq had always laid a territorial claim. Kuwait being a kind of a carve out from Mesopotamia and the province of Basra. That was why Bush had not only mobilized American power, but had also more laboriously pressed for months to construct an international coalition built on the UN. It was a truly remarkable alliance, 28 countries from 6 continents embracing traditional US values such as Britain and Australia, more prickly partners like France, and even Saddam's fellow Arabs in Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. The end of the Cold War, he declared, has been a victory for all humanity. Most strikingly of all was the cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, despite Saddam being a long-time Moscow client. The tanks that Saddam drove were Russian. He flew Hind helicopters in his armies, and his soldiers paraded with AK-47s, much as Syria and Egypt. I mean, the thing that the aspects of the Cold War, the Middle East aspects of the Cold War, I mean, you get very much kind of understated, but the Middle East is essentially a second front in the Cold War.
This NBA season, every shot you take with Fanatic Sportsbook puts points on the board. Earn up to 10% fan cash on your bets, win or lose. So even if your bet misses, you're still scoring fan cash, which unlocks exclusive rewards like authentic apparel, game tickets, and meeting legends at Fanatic's events. Make the switch and turn every bet into a bucket with Fanatic Sportsbook. Winning hits different here. Must be 21 plus. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-522-4700. MD, visit mdgamblinghelp.org. Offer not available in all states. Terms apply. See Fanatic Sportsbook app.
This rested on the now warm personal accord between Bush and Gorbachev, and on the community of universal values that they had been professing since the Malta summit of December 1989. Bush went out of his way to praise this in his address to Congress. Our relationship to the Soviet Union is important, not only to us, but to the world. If it is possible, I want to continue to build a lasting basis for US-Soviet cooperation, for a more peaceful future for all mankind. If it is possible. Behind the grand clarities of that evening on Capitol Hill, the picture was more complex. Moscow's recent violent crackdown in Lithuania cast a shadow over the gleaming rhetoric of freedom and independence. Bush was struggling to balance his principled assertion of democratic values within the USSR against his pragmatic need for Gorbachev's cooperation in the Gulf conflict and in building the New World Order. Other tensions also contorted the simplicity of the evening. Public opinion in America clearly dreaded the prospect of war, fearing very heavy casualties. Would the post-Cold War nation be willing to bear any burden, as John F. Kennedy had put it, for the sake of the new order? Bush offered his answer. Any cost in lives, any cost, is beyond our power to measure. But the cost of closing our eyes to aggression is beyond mankind's power to imagine. To reinforce that statement, he invoked lessons of history. As Americans, we know that there are times when we must step forward to accept our responsibility to lead the world away from the dark chaos of dictators, towards the brighter promise of a better day. Almost 50 years ago, we began the long struggle against an aggressive totalitarianism. Now we face another defining hour for America and for the world. Obviously, comparisons between the military power of Nazi Germany and the Axis and the kind of gangster state of Saddam Hussein are pretty ludicrous. There is a tendency within Western media to compare anybody, any third world dictator, to Hitler. How many kind of Hitler ratings are we going to give this guy? I think there was in the second Gulf War, there was some moronic commentator, probably Lindsey Graham, somebody like that, comparing Saddam to, I think, 9 Hitlers, I think it was, which I don't know how you do that maths, but there you have it. Not everyone believed that Kuwait was the defining challenge. As critical as the Gulf conflict is, the other business of the nation won't wait, declared Democratic Majority Leader Senator George Mitchell. The president says he seeks a new world order. We ask him to join us in putting our own house in order. We have a crisis abroad, but we also have a crisis here at home. Mitchell was referring to the country's recent slide into recession, which mattered more to the majority of Americans than faraway conflicts in the desert sands or the icy Baltic. Bush's bluff assurance that we will get this recession behind us and return to growth soon did not paper over the cracks between the White House and Capitol Hill about tax rises and the budget deficit. It was his inability to do that that left him as a one-term president. The power to lead abroad depended on the mobilization of consent at home. Like many American presidents, Bush therefore turned foreign policy into a moral issue. Yes, the United States bears the major share of leadership in this effort. Among the nations of the world, only the United States of America has both the moral standing and the means to back it up. We're the only nation on this earth that could assemble the forces of peace. This is the burden of leadership and the strength that has made America the beacon of freedom in a searching world. For Bush, Soviet cooperation was a necessary but not sufficient condition for his project. Ultimately, the New World Order would hinge on sustained American power and decisive presidential leadership. Now, it's interesting to contrast that with the present moment. The idea that an American president, or the current American president, would be willing to create a kind of a moral case, even though it doesn't take a kind of an international relations professor to show that the moral case for the first Gulf War was an absolute farce. I mean, we won't get into that. That's kind of shooting fish in a barrel. I don't want to go there just yet. But I want to just look at this kind of comparison. You have now a third Gulf War. It's in the Persian Gulf,
Had enough of your sportsbook holding back on the rewards? Fanatics Sportsbook opens a lane to a world of exclusive perks. Use Fan Cash to step up your tunnel walk with authentic NBA jerseys and vintage fits. Be there for the biggest moments with game tickets and rub shoulders with NBA greats through meetups and Fanatics experiences. Make the switch and get access to a highlight reel of rewards with Fanatics Sportsbook. Winning hits different here. Must be 21 plus. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-522-4700. MD, visit mdgamblinghelp.org. Offer not available in all states. Terms apply. See Fanatics Sportsbook app.
Perhaps even a fourth Gulf War, because there was a tanker war that the Americans were involved in during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And you have a president that has, after a chat with Netanyahu, become convinced that a mission to overthrow the regime in Tehran was a kind of going to be an easy win and something that they could just sort of have a bit of a roll of the dice of, and has ended it in Trump being ensnared in an unimaginable strategic disaster, the greatest strategic disaster in American history, bar none. As self-inflicted anyway. And the idea, the very language of the kind of liberal internationalism, which is always a veneer for American imperialism, that George W. Bush was using, Trump has eviscerated that to such an extent that to employ it now would be unthinkable. Um, I'm very much against the idea that when Trump does something, it's and is able to kind of bring about these kind of staggering radicalized changes, it's because of something necessarily special about him. Um, he's a sort of like almost like an avatar of the of a certain form of decay, and I would argue that the liberal internationalism of George H.W. Bush and the illiberal internationalism of his son George W. Bush presented Americans, quite rightly so, with a deep weariness and cynicism for overseas adventures, one that Trump has capitalized on. I mean, Trump says what it is he thinks people want to hear, and he has obviously disregarded any desire to stay out of overseas troubles. Not because Trump is a kind of a carrier of the torch of a Pax Americana and has carried on the traditions of Truman, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Johnson, so on and so forth. Far from it. It's far too erratic from that. He has dived into Venezuela, dived into Iran in a bid almost. I mean, I don't think he thinks. You don't think he has thinks through things in that particular way, but a bid almost to rip apart that Pax Americana and transform it the world into something similar to the kind of the rule of the great powers in the 19th century. I suspect, of course, much of the quote unquote ideological heavy lifting there and the geopolitical heavy lifting is born of people who are far more far-sighted than Trump, who look at the inevitable end of Pax Americana, the American peace, the imperium that has rested upon the projection of American power that is being dismantled at the moment. The world that George H.W. Bush inhabited at the end of the 1980s was one where the petrodollar was all powerful, but the petrodollar was propped up by American military power, American military bases, American military security guarantees. And those things together propped up a kind of an economic and a cultural hegemony that saw Pizza Huts in Moscow, McDonald's in Beijing. It saw a kind of Americanization of popular culture around the world. I remember, to my surprise, being in India in the early 1990s and finding out that everybody watched American sitcoms in the part of Mumbai that I was in, and they understood the kind of the nuances of American popular culture. I mean, of course, that was part of my naivety. I was about 19 at the time, but it shows you by the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s how far American-led globalization, cultural globalization, had penetrated, and none of those things are possible without the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the dollar cannot be the world's reserve currency without warships and aircraft to back it up. Which is why, and I hate to sound like a stuck record here, coming all the way back to the Persian Gulf, what Iran has done is so fundamental that Iran, unlike Vietnam or Afghanistan, where the empire was sent off with its tail between its legs, have it after a long guerrilla campaign with ground troops on and air power. You know, empires can survive a bit of a humiliation. What's happened here is the empire has actually been strategically and tactically defeated, and nothing it does now will succeed. So Iran has dealt America an epic blow, which is probably why most of Trump's generals, when Netanyahu came with his pitch, advised him strongly not to go for it, because there was no there was no strategic objectives, there's no exit strategy, and even if there were these two things, there's no route to a win. There's no way that this works at all. And once you show, I mean, it's one of the great catastrophes is once you show that that American power is like Russian power in Ukraine, it's nowhere near as all-conquering as we may have been led to believe. It causes fragmentation of power in unprecedented ways. We've yet to see the consequences of the Gulf. We might not of the current Gulf crisis, and they may not be fully realised for quite some time. And what this moment, the moment of Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and the end of the Cold War against Russia shows us, is the distance of travel. But remember, the early 1990s, this is, under 40 years ago. And the decline in power, again, we shouldn't just assume that that is the product of Trump. I think Trump, the way you see him, realistically, is an accelerant to an ongoing process. Anyway, I'll leave you there and hopefully hop on again tomorrow. Take care, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye.
For a small business owner, every day is full of surprises. Some great, some not so great. Like when a client cancels their order at the last minute. But here's a surprise you will like. Progressive provides small business owners with 30 customizable coverage options to help keep their business going strong. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates and third-party insurers. Coverage is not available in all states or for all vehicles and coverage selections.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.